This is question number 8 on the 4.1 and 4.2 part 1 my math lab homework. And in this problem, we're given descriptions of first derivatives and second derivatives, and we're being asked to match those descriptions with different graphs. Okay, so let's look at 13. What information are we given in 13? So 13 tells us that the first derivative is greater than 0 and the second derivative is greater than 0. So let's break that down. What is that telling us? Well, when your first derivative is greater than 0, that's another way of saying that your first derivative is positive. And remember, that first derivative is describing the tangent lines of the original graph. And I can look here on the graphs provided for me. They're all graphs of f of x. That's the original function. So f prime of x is describing the tangent lines on those graphs. And if f prime of x is positive, that means my tangent lines have positive slopes. So if I drew an arrow, a tangent line, it might be pointing up. Okay, now, and it's also telling me that my second derivative, f double prime of x, is greater than 0. That means my second derivative is also positive, and the second derivative describes the shape of the graph. Now you have two choices. You have a concave up shape or you have a concave down shape. And if the second derivative is positive, it's describing the shape as concave up. So I know that my graph of the original function needs to be concave up. Okay, so let's see what graphs would meet these conditions. So I'm going to focus on the concave up part first. So when a graph is concave up, it can be this U-shaped graph, or it can be any part of that U. It can look like this, it could look like that, or be the whole U. Here I can see it's partial, so it's either going to look like one of these pieces here. So I'm either dealing with this graph here, graph D, or I'm dealing with graph C. Those are each 1/2 of an upward facing U. Okay, so it's one of those, and then I have to look at the tangent line. So if I pick any point on that graph, I can see in graph D, the tangent line is pointing down. That means the first derivative would be less than 0. The first derivative would be negative. Whereas in graph C over here, if I pick a point on that curve, my tangent line would be pointing up. That means that the first derivative would be greater than 0 at that point, or positive. And that's what we're looking for in description 13. So I would drag graph C to 13. And it's a little tricky with a drag and drop. Kind of have to play around until it fits in there. If you're having any issues, just email me and I can email me your answers and I can overwrite the gradebook for you. Okay, so while we're on this concave up one, let's figure out what D would have to be. So the other concave up option is 15. And see how 15 says this first derivative would be negative. So I can match 15 with a concave up, but a negative sloping tangent line. And we just discovered that was going to be D right there. So I'll actually match D to 15. Okay, so my other two graphs, those are going to be my concave down graphs, because see how the second derivative is less than 0. That means the second derivative is negative for both of those descriptions in 14 and 16. And that means my graph is going to be concave down. Concave down is that downward pointing U, or any part of that downward pointing U. So I can see I have a left half of a downward U there in A, and I have the right half of a downward U in B. So both of those graphs are concave down. The way I'll figure out how to match it is with those tangent lines. So in A, if I drew a tangent line at that point, see how the tangent line would be pointing up? That means my first derivative would be greater than 0. The tangent line, the slope of the tangent line is positive. And in B, if I pick a point along that curve, my tangent line would be pointing down. So my first derivative would be less than 0. It would be negative there. So 14 is saying that the first derivative is positive. That's where my tangent line is pointing up. So I'll match A to 14. And number 16 is saying that the first derivative is less than 0. That means negative. That means that tangent line would be pointing down. So I would match that over there with 16. So the main takeaway of this problem is to train your brain what information the first derivative gives us about the original graph of f of x and what the second derivative gives me about the original graph of f. So we're training our brains to see that the first derivative is telling us about the slopes of the tangent lines on that original f of x graph, and the second derivative is telling us about the shape or the concavity of that f of x graph. So first derivative, slopes of tangent lines of the f of x graph, second derivative, concavity of the f of x graph. And again, if you're having any issues on the technology side with this drag and drop feature, just send me an email, click Ask the Instructor, send me an email with your answers, and I will override that score in the gradebook for you.